Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Right now, the authorities are performing an autopsy on the lifeless remains of a 16-year-old. What was once a shining, joyful, sparkling beacon of life is now a lifeless shell. The toxicology is about probing microscopically into the tissues to find out on a chemical level what may have altered Kiely's perception, cognition, processing. They will also attempt to discover manner and cause of death. I've heard a few commentators saying we should wait now for the forensic results. But right here is where True Crime Rocket Science enters that difficult territory, really that most difficult psychological terrain of all, death. I don't think it's rocket science to say, shocking as this may sound, that Kiely died because she drowned. She drowned alone, in the dark, inside her vehicle. Although death is a part of life, we seldom really go there. We so seldom open ourselves to it that when we do, it feels like walking on the moon. Part of being an authentic channel means opening ourselves to important themes like the most important one, contemplating our own extinction. We enter this forbidding territory not to be gratuitous. In fact, you will see we will spend very little time in these dark places, less time, I suppose, than we really ought to. But the reason we do it is to go to the same place the autopsy and toxicology does. In other words, we're simply following the natural course of our investigation, and this is a true crime channel. We simply go there by a different route. This is where we really address the question, what happened to Kiely? We're not satisfied with just finding her or that she's no longer alive. We want to know how she died. And although an autopsy and toxicology is part of that explanation, the real story is the real story. The reality is the reality that Kiely experienced. When the autopsy comes out and the toxicology with it, these will provide us glimpses of the real story, but without actually telling that story. Does that make sense? And so it is the ambit of this channel to try to tell that story, to try to give the victim a voice, to try and show you what this person went through. And we spend so much time examining everybody else and everything else. We don't really deal with the most important thing. What did Kiely go through that has brought us to this point? Now, the great question, and naturally the greater issue around this story, is that when we ask how someone dies, we're actually confronting a much greater problem, and one we try to avoid for much of our lives. When we ask how someone dies, we're really asking how we might someday die, as if the fiction really existed all along, that someone may die, yes, but not us. It's the natural narcissism at work that allows us to overcome what would otherwise be a paralyzing anxiety, day by day, night after night. And part of the serious work of this channel is to be authentic about this source of anxiety, to acknowledge it, to deal with it, and to say, yes, this is a part of life. And you know, life is real. It's not a fairy tale, and it never was. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Bear in mind, I'll be putting up episode 4 in the Clue That We Missed series later today, so look out for that. And let's get started. Remember, the moment you are born, the clock starts counting down, doesn't it? Death is the ultimate slayer of fairy tales, as we saw with Kiely, but rest assured, it comes to us all. There is no escape from this. And that is the first insight into Kiely's terrible fate at around 12:33 on Saturday, August 6th. In the wet, inky darkness, there was no escape. So the investigators will now try to reimagine the events, the speed of the vehicle, the trajectory when it hit the water, Kiely's state of mind, and also, what happened inside the capsule afterwards, after it entered the water. What happened to the person behind the driver's console? Was she wearing a seatbelt? Did the airbag deploy? How exactly did the vehicle flip on its side? Do not imagine that her last moments were brief or bearable. They were as unpleasant as a watery grave can be. Inside the capsule, Kiely would have shrieked, piercing screams deadened by the vastness of the night, the remoteness of the sight, and the persistence of dark water writhing over her like a snake. Her blonde hair and white sweater, odd future, would have been saturated with it. It may take as long as 60 seconds to drown, and the more one thrashed against it, the faster the water gets to work. It is probably one of the worst ways to die because it's so gradual. One has a premeditated sense of what happens as it happens, and then it happens, and there is no escape. Kiely screamed inside, but the shielding of the SUV was now an inescapable cage, and words reduced to bubbles. Outside, if he had been standing there, the surface water, disrupted, disturbed, would have simply woven back together, and all light below extinguished. And then silence. When the first searchers arrived, kicking the gravel nearby, silence. When helicopters whooped overhead, silence. When boats buzzed and vehicles groaned hither and thither, and more people chatted there and across the ether, the same persistent, permanent silence. Something that had once existed now no longer did. Someone who once spoke and laughed and kissed now no longer could. This great assembly of life and knowledge and limbs and lust for life, undone in a thrashing 60 seconds. And then, finally, bubbles approaching from above to remove the shell inside the shell, the lifeless doll inside a silver coffin. In the movie The Abyss, drowning is dramatized, and if it looks and sounds uncomfortable and unpleasant, that's because it is. What happened to Kiely is a reminder.
It is possible to die. It is possible to die.
At any moment, at every moment, it is possible to die. One reason Kiely died was that she simply ignored or wasn't aware or was distracted from this possibility. In the midst of being high, Kiely was brought down low, literally submerged, and her life snuffed out. If death is an opponent, death was lurking while Kiely was looking the other way. This is why being alert, being vigilant, can save our lives, especially while we are driving, especially when we're young. If these seniors were intoxicated as a sort of celebration of freedom and glimpses of power, as outsiders, we've seen social media get intoxicated by a different kind of celebration, a kind of bloodlust associated with hunting and destruction, as we see in Lord of the Flies. Ernest Becker, an American cultural anthropologist and the author of a 1974 Pulitzer Prize winner, describes aggression as an organismic self-affirmation over other forms of life. When you see other creators jabbing their fingers at suspects, as we saw in this case, what you're really seeing is something similar to children who take pleasure in dismembering insects. Becker writes in The Birth and Death of Meaning, quote, "It is a kind of clumsy aesthetics, a stubborn dealing with the basic coin of nature. You make your equations of meaning with the most elemental of materials, those which have their natural value embedded within them, so that there can be no symbolic falsifications or intellectual misjudgments. Blood is blood, a life is a life. You spill it, you sacrifice it, you die. It is also very clear and final, even clean. We can see that it represents the fascination with a simple truth in a world where things are treacherously complex, second-hand, and false. It is allied to the truth of sexual indulgence, the primary value of body experiences in a world of symbolic artificiality. Whereas children use insects, the deprived adult uses others. They blame others. he gets a feeling of plenitude and self-expansion in inflicting pain, if only by using words or slurs. End quote. Becker cites the little sadistic aggressions of everyday life when we belittle others, ride them, point out their defects to them. He goes on to say, quote, "This gives us a sense of balance, draws us up to a level where we can relate as equals while cutting others down to manageable size." End quote. And then finally, Becker concludes saying, "The reason for this added viciousness is that man compensates for his physical insecurity by psychological tricks, something no other animal can do. And this is what makes man so naturally dangerous. Does he fear death? Well, then he can sacrifice someone else in his place to pay off death, to buy it off. I mean, someone has to pay for the serenity of a utopia cleansed of evil." End quote. And isn't that what Kiely did for the sanctuary, cleansed it of evil? Isn't that what Ralph failed to do in The Lord of the Flies? And so, why do we even venture here? What is the conscious and unconscious process here? Well, just this.
Someone has to die in order that the rest of us should value life more.
Virginia Woolf also said, all this must go on without her. Did she resent it? Or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? End quote. Death is a lot less frightening when you remove the fairy tale. Then it's simply there, and so are we. Yeah, we are alive and aware, and still we have some time on our hands. What are we going to do with it? We must do something. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.